Grace and peace, friends. So last week we were thinking together about the kinds of changes that we need to support the ethic that we need. And one of the changes that we introduced 2 weeks ago was that nature had to have a moral status. So this week we want to bring that back to the front. But before we can think about what it means for nature to have a moral status, we have to think about what it means when we say moral. And so Rasmussen begins us this week with a discussion about the difference between morality and ethics. And of course, he says that morality is kind of the code that's socially agreed, the mores about what actions generally promote the good for society. And ethics, he relates to that Greek word for stable, which is to say something systematic, a framework under which we make decisions or judgments about what is good. Now, through the Gilkey story, Rasmussen reminds us that often these moral theories conflict with each other, and we can have different outcomes. And so to help us think through that and why that is, he introduces quickly and roughly three large systems by which we make moral judgments. The first is character, or virtue-based. The second is consequentialist, or utilitarian. And the third is deontological. Character, or virtue-based theories, is usually related to the thoughts of Aristotle, who, by his example, we understand that virtues are cultivated or formed by the person in their doing. So he has this quote on page 134, where Aristotle says, "We become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, brave by doing brave acts." So the idea is that the doer forms the virtues in their doing. This kind of relates to Rasmussen's statement that some of you saw from last week: behavioral changes precede attitudinal ones. That is, the doing often gets us into a different mindset. That's basically character or virtue-based theory. Secondly is consequentialist, or utilitarian ethics, which is to say that the morality of an act is not situated with the doer. It's not situated in the action or the character of the person. Rather, it's interpreted by the outcome. If the outcome of an action generally increases a social good or pleasure as opposed to pain, then that can be judged to be a moral act. And then the third is deontology, which is normally associated with the thinking of Immanuel Kant, whose shadow looms large and long over much of what we do and say in terms of moral theories these days, but there are more deontologists than just Immanuel Kant. But they share two common foundations, which is that what is moral is our duty towards a universally good maxim. The idea is that an act is moral when it's done out of a sense of duty to some law about what is good. We have no self-interested thing to gain. We're simply acting in accordance with a universal maxim. That is a moral act. Secondly, that everything towards which we act, we interpret or understand as an end to itself, never a means. So another agent, another object is always a subject, an end unto itself, never a means towards some other end, social or otherwise. So those are those roughly three different schools of moral theories. But on page 143, Rasmussen says, "The ethic we need is not some segregated, autonomous environmental ethic with fundamentally different moral categories, including human character, ends, and obligation, all pertain as to other categories and concerns we will explore. None drop out as the moral universe moves its boundary from the ego to the ecosphere." And that's an end quote. So he's basically saying the ethic that we need is not going to be found in one of these schools of moral theories. It has to include some of the best thinking from all of them, so that we can build actually not just laws or not just new ways to measure outcomes, but to help us build a new sense of self. Now, as you were dealing in some of your comments last week, where will this change come from? Rasmussen says yes is the answer. And that's going to have that kind of change that creates behavioral change that affects the health of the environment. That's going to take some moral vision. And to illustrate that, he gives us this story about these doctors who were making some decisions about medical ethics related to care given to people with different abilities. And there was a man there who was the object of their discussion, and in their understanding that this was not an object, but he was a subject in himself, who had moral status, who they needed to make a better moral decision. Rasmussen says their sense of humanity expanded. And this is the issue for this week. How does our relationship to nature help us expand our sense of humanity, to expand our moral identity, to be intersubjective, that is, one that includes nature and creatures themselves, that can help us expand our sense of self or humanity to include non-humans and even things that are non-living creatures in the environment, so that we define our moral sense of self and therefore how it is that we do moral judgment reasoning in understanding that we are united with, as Rasmussen says, the whole oikumene, the whole inhabited earth, where every creature in it is united in a kingdom of ends, as Kant says, where every creature is an end that contributes to our moral discernment. Now, this goes a long way to getting us towards his final issue about creation justice, where it has to include, along with his critique of Sandel's theory, it has to include a distribution of social goods as well as welfare and freedom of every creature and end unto themselves. And so to remind us in a kind of poetic or aesthetic means, he introduces and leaves us with The Animal's Lawsuit, which is a great Sufi poem. And the king, remember, says in the end, the judgment is that it's humans who have lost their sense of judgment, because we have failed to see and hear what the wild winds have to say. We failed to listen to the other moral agents in creation, which is all of God's creatures. Now, this is very interesting to me, because here in Senegal, the predominant religion is Sufism, a Sufi form of Islam, from which the Animal's Lawsuit comes. And here in Senegal, there are lots of practices that we see that tend to honor the agency of non-human parts of creation. One, just to illustrate, is that children after a meal always go to their mother to thank them for preparing the meal, who will send them to the father for either buying or cultivating the food, who will then turn their children to thank God for supplying and furnishing, and the plants and the animals for having given themselves for our nourishment. Now, if you ignore the obvious gender biases in that story, you see a great attachment of moral significance to the non-human world. And it's rooted in a Senegalese experience of gratitude for having lived on the edge with the land. This is listening to what the wild winds has to say. This is like the trees clapping their hands and us hearing it, nature giving us signals. Like right here in Dakar, and if I can detain you for just another minute, you'll see behind me in the sky that it looks like it's a kind of hazy or a cloud-covered day. But we're in the middle of the dry season. There are no clouds in the air. What you see is the dust from the Sahara Desert that blows in and really dirties the air and the whole environment at this time of year. The Sahara Desert is advancing. And this is a result of the colonial practice during French colonialism of monocropping peanuts that actually dried out and desiccated and decimated the topsoil. And that has taken out the green buffer of that stood between the rest of Senegal and sub-Saharan Africa and the Sahara Desert. This is all a result of economic practice of monocropping. And the land itself is disintegrating. It's just one more example, like the mountaintop removal video, where injustice to creation is wrought because economics are allowed to be sovereign and not a part of a whole ecumenical sense of what is good. So if, as Rasmussen suggests, the current society or the very fabric of creation is coming apart by its own self-disintegrating logic, then what's a logic that unites it all? That's the kind of ethic we need, Rasmussen says. That is the stable, the forum for ethical deliberation in which the cries of nature are heard and taken into account. That sets the parameters for how we define words like growth, consumption, and regeneration, not vice versa. So how are we going to develop that? He says at the end of chapter that it's going to be varied and include lots of voices, and it's rarely best done according to theories that we outline. It has to be heard by experience. So this is our need to be among creation and hear them in their communication. So for theological ethics, the questions this week will be around what it is that we contribute to this, this varied approach. It won't be found, as Rasmussen says, in merely technological or eco-modernist approaches. So how does our theological heritage contribute to the ethic that we need